Thank you. Our speaker today is the director of the Weidenbaum Center on the Economy, Government, and Public Policy and a professor of political science at Washington University in St. Louis. He studies elections, public opinion, and executive politics. His research examines the interchange between institutions and the behavior with a focus on political accountability and public policy in the United States. His most recent book, No Blank Check: The Origins and Consequences of Public Antipathy Towards Presidential Power, is done with John C. Rogansky. I probably mispronounced that, and published in 22 by Cambridge University Press. Please join me in welcoming Andrew Reeves.
All right, give me a second just to get set up here. All right, great. Thank you so much for inviting me to come and speak to you today. It's always a real pleasure to share my research. And in addition to that, it's been a real pleasure to learn a little bit more about this group and to be here today to partake in the celebration. So thank you for all of that. Yes, I'm a political scientist, or as I tell people when I sit next to them on a plane, I'm a 7th grade algebra teacher, right? Because you can get into some really tough conversations on a plane if somebody knows you're a political science professor, but I'm letting you in on the secret. The focus of my talk today is how Americans feel about unilateral presidential power. Now, some suggest that given the partisan polarization, presidential supporters are simply going to hand their president a blank check to do whatever he or she chooses. But we argue that this isn't the case, right? And one of the reasons that this question is important because it bears very directly on the health of American democracy, right? One of the threats to democracy, both here and abroad throughout the world, is that a popular chief executive will weaken or eliminate democratic institutions. This is an idea called executive aggrandizement. And then that's going to happen without a peep, right? And maybe even some cheering by the public. So while our book mostly includes evidence from surveys about citizens, and that's some evidence I'm going to show you today, the bigger question is how we check presidential power, right? Which during the past 50, 100, really 200 years, the life of our country has grown in substantial ways. Presidents have increasingly used unilateral actions to accomplish their policy goals. Pictured here are the last 9 presidents sitting at desks signing executive orders. Today, I am talking not just about executive orders, right? I'm not really interested in the technical aspects of whether it's a memoranda or an executive agreement or an executive order. I'm really interested in the broad class of executive powers that presidents use. And of course, the focus on this research is how the public reacts to these different approaches. Some of us, at least, can remember back to the Obama administration. As a candidate, Obama criticized executive power, but as a president, he came to embrace it. He used unilateral powers to accomplish a wide range of policy outcomes, including rejecting the Keystone Pipeline, making recess appointments, gun control, and so on, and so on, and so on. Now, many Americans took issue with these executive actions. Among that group was, I don't know why that photo always gets a laugh, but among that group was John Boehner, right? Pictured here when he was the Republican Speaker of the House. In late 2014, Boehner declared that he was going to sue President Obama over his use of unilateral power. And he did just that one day after Obama announced unilateral action on immigration, though the suit itself was actually related to other unilateral actions related to Obamacare. So Boehner wrote an op-ed explaining why he was doing this, and he said that the president has circumvented the American people and their elected representatives through executive action, as if daring the American people to stop him. But to Speaker Boehner's claim, right, do the American people care? Now, if we recall back to the 2020 election, we have candidates running on unilateral power agendas. This headline details the plans of then candidate Harris in using unilateral powers to accomplish her goals. Let me tell you, former President Trump has already made strengthening and expanding the powers of the presidency a central part of his re-election bid in this current campaign cycle. It's a bipartisan issue here. Back in 2016, Hillary Clinton ran on an agenda of executive power, and according to some, right, it came at no risk, came at no political cost. That's because, at least as others claim, executive orders, executive power is about process. And the public is largely unmoved by process, right? Maybe unless you live inside of the 270 in Washington, D.C. But how do Americans view presidential power? Do they care about presidential power, or do they simply follow the political winds of whomever they support? That's one of the central questions of my book, No Blank Check, which I've co-authored with John Rogowski, perfect pronunciation, of the University of Chicago. Now, our basic thesis, or one of the arguments that we make, is that the public does, in fact, react negatively to unilateral power. And today, I'm going to give you a tour of some of these attitudes, and then I'm going to consider their origins. Now, this is a long 300-plus page book, so I'm not going to get into everything. We have further evidence that looks at how particular policies are punished or penalized when presidents take unilateral action. But today, we're going to think about where those attitudes come from. Let me back up and lay out three potential answers to this question of how Americans view presidential power. So the first is sort of this non-attitudes explanation that we just don't care, right? Which we saw articulated in the media coverage a couple slides ago. Second is this idea of a partisan lens, which I'll talk about. And third is our hypothesis that we can actually separate the president from the presidency and bring independent judgments to those policy decisions. Okay, so the first idea is that Americans may not have any views of presidential power, right? Just for reference, this is not the masses are Democrats, okay? It's supposed to rhyme, and you can figure it out yourself, I'm sure. Right, and look, hey, the American public has low levels of political knowledge, which perhaps renders them incapable of mustering an independent view of the means by which something gets done. Right? This perspective suggests that Americans are too ignorant of politics to care about questions around process. And when you can take surveys and see, less than half of Americans can name the three branches of government. Right? Surely they will not pay attention to obscure questions of how a president is exercising power. Now look, I'll quickly say we don't find much evidence for this here, right? In part that's because we think, this isn't exactly a process question about, how many votes does it take to override a filibuster, right? This is something a little more visceral when presidents exercise this type of power. A second perspective is the idea that partisanship will drive these attitudes. Now, this is related to the first question, the first perspective, but instead of ignorance, right, it's partisanship that fills that void, and in the extreme, perfectly predicts support for unilateral power. Right? We can take a bit of an extreme example. When Donald Trump was not president, he did not like unilateral power that Obama was exercising, right? But as soon as he became president, him and all of his supporters suddenly had a much rosier view of unilateral power, right? That's sort of our partisan lens here. This is really distressing for democracy, right? And this isn't a Donald Trump story. This applies to both sides, right? If we're willing to hand a president that we support the keys to the castle to enact those policies in any way that he or she sees fit, that's democratic backsliding, right? And we have to be vigilant about that. So what we argue is that, in fact, Americans have a more principled view of how power is supposed to operate. It's very easy to imagine views of the president and the person holding the office, as well as the presidency, are identical. But we find that's not the case, right? Get ready for this graphic here. So what we find is that Americans can actually separate their view from their view of the president from their view of the presidency, right? You can all see why I'm not a graphic designer. I thought that was really mind-blowing when I figured out how to do that last night. So we argue that when it comes to the presidential use of unilateral power, citizens do have attitudes towards process which are driven by core democratic values. Americans hold a view of the office and its powers as distinct from the individual holding the office. To be clear, look, partisanship is really important here, and we find compelling evidence of a partisan lens, but we also find evidence of an institutional lens. So let me move on a little bit and show you some of our evidence. I want to paint a picture of what public support for unilateral action looks like. Now, we relied on a bunch of survey questions throughout the number of years that we worked on this project, but I want to focus on just one, and I'm going to refer back to this one throughout the talk. We asked our survey takers, we said, think about the office of the presidency and not any particular president. Please indicate whether you agree or disagree that a president should have the right to enact policies without having those policies voted on by Congress. I'm going to refer to this as shorthand as unilateral policymaking, right? And this really gets at a key concept that we're interested in looking at. Now, before I show you some of our evidence, let me collect some data here. Let's see if this works. Okay, great. So I know this is hard to see. I'm going to try to make it bigger in a second. You can pull out your phone and go to pollev.com/AJ Reeves, which is right there. Or you can try to scan that QR code. Let me see if I can make that bigger by chance. And you should be able to register your view. Whether you agree that a president should have the right to enact policies without having those policies voted on by Congress, or whether you disagree with that statement. All right, we're at 50-50. Give folks a couple more minutes. I'm sure there are all sorts of things going through your mind right now, like, oh, this is a crappy survey question. What about if it's in the context of war? Or at least this is what my wife was telling me this morning when I was giving her a version of the talk. We explore those contextual factors certainly throughout the book, but this gives us a good baseline, right? Sort of a theoretical, non-technical look at how people view presidential power. We see that in this room, right, it's a little bit of a split decision, but we have a majority who disagree that a president should have the right to enact policies without having those policies voted on by Congress, right? You can imagine what we do in the rest of our book. Well, what if it's about abortion? What if it's about medical marijuana legalization, right? We explore how those different particular policies impact these views. But this is not all that different from what we find in our own analyses. We asked this question on nationally representative surveys that were sponsored by the Weidenbaum Center at WashU. We ran this survey 9 times between January 2014 and January 2018. And you can see those results here now. Right? We see that overall, support for unilateral policymaking is quite low. Across polls, average supports sits just below 20%. That's that dashed line that you can hopefully see on the slide. The support ranges from a low of 10% in November 2016 to a high of about 28% in January 2015. So you see some baseline evidence of one of our takeaways here, right? There's actually some pretty consistent public opinion out there that people are not gung-ho on these questions of unilateral power. But what about the partisan lens I was talking about a few minutes ago, right? As you may have noticed, we actually asked this question under both President Obama and President Trump, right? So we get those 2 last waves in May and January of 17 and 18 are under newly inaugurated President Trump. So how does this support vary by partisanship? Well, you see it in front of you now. These are the same results, but we've broken it down by party. So in January 2014, right, you can see that only 13% of Republicans supported unilateral power compared to 33% of Democrats. So that's about a 20-point gap. Now this switches when Trump becomes president in January of 2018. 22% of Republicans supported unilateral power, while only 11% of Democrats agree. This is a gap of 11 points, right? So we have partisan gaps in these results. But hold on, right? First thing I want to note is that the overall levels of support here are low, right? Never for Republicans, never for Democrats does support hit 50%. It's always substantially below. And the other thing that I want to do is think about what's our comparison, right? Let's consider another context. Let's think about presidential approval. Right? Here, we see a powerful partisan lens, right? These are the results from our very same survey takers. And what we see is that among Democrats, right, Obama's approval sits at about 80% throughout his term. And then as soon as Trump is elected, right, that plummets down to the single digits. And the pattern is in reverse for Republicans. So while there is partisan polarization when it comes to unilateral policymaking, the gap is relatively modest, right? We're talking about gaps here, gaps between the blue and the red, the Democrats and Republicans, of between 4 and 29 points. For presidential approval, the partisan gap is as much as 18 times larger than that and ranges from 65 to 71 points. So to summarize, right, compared to presidential approval, support for unilateral powers is substantially lower. It's relatively stable. And is there partisan polarization? Yes, but it's a heck of a lot less polarized than a lot of other political issues out there, especially as we look at presidential approval here. Okay, so next, let me turn to this question of where these attitudes come from. So pictured here is a cover of our book on your left. This is a stylized adaptation of the painting on the right, which depicts the pulling down of a statue of George III. This is happening in Bowling Green, New York on July 9th, 1776, following a reading of the Declaration of Independence. I really like this depiction because I think it's a nice representation of our thesis. Americans don't like executive power. This disdain stems from values that Americans have about democracy. As a nation, this antipathy is perhaps best represented by our Declaration of Independence. What does the Declaration of Independence do? Anybody who's read the Declaration of Independence in the last 5 years? Okay, what is it?
It's a listing of things that we don't like about King George III.
Exactly. It's an indictment of executive kingly power, right? So, just as these subjects here are committing this ultimate heresy in their rejection of a strong executive in the form of a king, right? Americans today regard unilateral powers with suspicion. Okay, so we spend considerable effort in the book exploring the origins of these attitudes. And one of the most consistent findings in our book is that attitudes towards the rule of law, which is a core, small d democratic value, is a robust and durable predictor of support for unilateral powers. Even after we account for partisanship and presidential approval and race and gender and all of those other things that we think might make a difference. The stronger your belief in the rule of law, the more opposed you will be to unilateral power. Now, for all of our survey takers, we asked them to register their agreement with the 5 statements that you can read on the screen behind me here. This is how we measure support for the rule of law. These statements have to do with just how inviolable you think the law is, right? Is it ever okay not to follow a law you consider unjust? Would it be better to ignore the law and come up with a more expedient solution if there's a pressing problem happening in the world, right? Just how necessary is it to follow the law? You can read these statements for yourself, and I want to again take the temperature of the room. I'm going to adjust one of these statements, and I'm going to ask you whether you agree or disagree that it is necessary to obey a law even if you consider it unjust. You should be able to hit refresh on that link. And I'm curious, especially in this group, to see what our results yield. Do you agree or disagree that it is not... Oh, I screwed this up. This is just an illustration of the perils of survey testing, actually. So let's take it as written here on the slide. It is not necessary to obey a law you consider unjust. Do you agree or disagree with that statement? You can go to pollev.com/AJ Reeves, or you can try to scan that QR code there. Okay, I've screwed this up because on my slide here it says something different from what it says up there. So you can change your answer. It is necessary to obey a law even if you consider it unjust. So we have about 21% agreeing and 80% disagreeing. This group is probably exceptional when we look at the American public as a whole. We tend to see very high levels of support, very high levels of deference for the law. It opens up a really interesting question about normatively, is this a good thing or a bad thing, right? Deference is frequently something that we don't desire, right? In this case, however, we see this as a predictor of how people view unilateral power. All right. So as I said, our scale is formed from these questions, and we find it to be an extremely powerful and robust predictor of your feeling toward unilateral power. Just to give you an example, in our analysis, we find that if you take someone and they move from being one of the weakest supporters of the rule of law to being among the most ardent supporters of the rule of law, that's associated with about a 29 percentage point increase in the likelihood of opposing unilateral policymaking, that question that I showed you earlier. That's comparable to the effect of moving from strongly disapproving to strongly approving of the president, right? So it is in the same ballpark as these partisan effects of which we might be worried about. Okay, where we could have had the band come up, and we're going to do Hamilton now. So where do these democratic values come from, right? What shapes how we view the rule of law? This is not something we explicitly consider in our book, explicitly analyze in our book, but we do consider some of these questions. Part of it certainly has to do with socialization, right? We learn about the Declaration of Independence and our nation's early experience with tyrannical executive power, right? King George is usually the bad guy in what we're watching, right? Certainly is the case when we go see Hamilton. We're reminded of this struggle every July 4th, right? When we reflect on the nation's founding and think about the Declaration of Independence. And of course, we learn about civics in school, right? So our civic culture and civic education may make us skeptical of executive power. Right? As another team of scholars has described, there's almost a cultural tyrannophobia that you can trace through American history, sort of this inborn skepticism of presidential power. But I should note that I don't think this is a case of American exceptionalism. Right? We look at these relationships among citizens in other parts of the world and reach similar conclusions. So I also think we have to highlight that, yes, many political processes may be obscure. I gave the example of, where's the veto pivot in Congress? What's the filibuster pivot in the Senate? That's different from having a visceral reaction to a president avoiding the legislative processes to accomplish his or her goals, right? And this idea of being free from arbitrary uses of power, right? You don't need a PhD in anything to have that feeling, right? And that likely, too, in part animates what we see here. I'll also note that when we look at the popular discourse, whether it's a Republican president or Democratic president, we often see presidential power attacked in the very terms I just described. A president who takes unilateral action to affect immigration policy, to address student loan debt, to levy new steel and aluminum tariffs is opening themselves up to the types of criticisms you see behind me. They're going to be called lawless. They're going to be called emperors. They're going to be depicted as kings, as you can see our last four presidents at the bottom of your screen here. Right, so this reflects sort of this tension that our friends in the media are aware of and certainly play up around these issues. All right, just three more slides. So just to recap, public support for unilateral presidential power is weak. It's relatively stable, somewhat polarized. It's also driven by core values, right? It's not a coin flip. It's not something that is just being driven by partisanship right, there are some core values that people bring to bear on these questions. In other parts of the book, we show that the public punishes unilateral policies, so we get a little more into the specifics and look to see what those penalties look like. We go back through the historical record and try to identify every poll that's ever been done around unilateral policies. We find no relationship there between presidential approval and their likelihood of trying to, seize these powers. And as I mentioned, this relationship also exists in countries around the world. This is not a US-specific phenomenon. So let me conclude with 3 thoughts. I'm a political scientist who studies the presidency, and one of our sort of baseline understandings of presidents is that they are seekers of power, right? Their North Star, if you had to deduce it down, is power. America's founding reckoned with designing an office that was energetic, but one that would not enable tyranny or dictatorship. That said, the institutional checks on the executive branch, that is Congress and the courts, leave a heck of a lot to be desired, right? Congress is hard-pressed to do anything, given the nature of collective action and the current state of partisan polarization. They are not well equipped to try to rein in the power of a president. Though this may be changing, the courts have historically been extremely deferential to the executive branch. That leaves you and me, right? I don't propose that the public is a 100% effective antidote for executive aggrandizement, but the public also does not write a blank check to their preferred office holders. This is crucial for the health of democracy around the world. Finally, we need more research on how to ensure a vigilant citizenry. Right? One near constant refrain is for more civics education. That may well be a good idea, though I've yet to see a convincing academic study that shows the link between civics education and different types of political behavior here. But we also have to keep in mind that as younger Americans are entering a system of limited economic mobility and a political system that seems ineffective and is seen to consist of outmoded political institutions, right, that too may erode the public's defense of the rule of law, and we have to be susceptible to that. I'm going to end, but before I end, I want to offer an invitation. I'm the director of the Weidenbaum Center, and about monthly during the semester, we have either a policy lunch or we have a big forum, and we bring in speakers to give nonpartisan talks. A lot of it's on research, but we bring in some practitioners as well. You can take a look at some of the past or upcoming legislation. We have a really fantastic journalist coming to talk about artificial intelligence and some programming around the environment this semester. We put these events on for the WashU community and also for our donor group. I'm not going to pass the hat and try to collect donations for the Weidenbaum Center, but what I would love to do is just invite you to come to one of these as my guest and see what we're about. And you all seem civic-minded and participatory, so I just wanted to throw that invitation out there. My email address, reeves@wusel.edu. You can learn more about the Weidenbaum Center and look at some of our upcoming program at our website, wc.wusel.edu. And I'll say thank you for allowing me to present today. Thank you.